Hello, folks. This past week, I found myself on a southbound Acela on my way to see something that's been on my bucket list for a long time, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. We'll get to the real trains momentarily, but this museum also has several spectacular model train layouts, including this HO scale representation of Baltimore in 1997, which happens to be the year I was born. The overall track plan is vaguely similar to my layout, but it's a lot larger and incorporates some very impressive buildings and scenic features. From there, we moved on to my favorite part of the museum, the Roundhouse. This building is 125 feet tall, over an acre in footprint, and was built in 1884, and it's pretty impressive by itself, not even counting the trains inside. I'm about to get real nerdy about 19th century locomotive design, so buckle up. This is the William Mason, otherwise known as Baltimore and Ohio No. 25. Built in 1856 by the Mason Machine Works, this engine hauled Union troops and supplies during the Civil War, and would go on to become a movie star nearly a century later. This engine was an early example of many features that would go on to become standard for American steam locomotives, but it has some unique quirks as well that weren't carried over to most later designs. One such quirk is that this engine has no brakes. When pulling a train, it was expected to use the brakes on the cars, and when running by itself, slowing down was done by putting it in reverse and applying throttle. The tender does have a handbrake to prevent it from rolling down hills, but the engine itself has no brakes at all. You may also notice that the front pair of drivers are blind, meaning they have no flanges to keep them on the rails. Unlike most later 440s, the pilot truck on this one only swivels. It doesn't slide left and right as the engine goes around corners, so the front pair of drivers needs to be able to slide back and forth on the rail itself. Interesting, so that's how these older style crossheads work. So you've got a greasing point on there, a greasing point on there, and a greasing point for the actual pivot. And then something I've noticed on models a lot, the main rod is on the inside on the main driver, and then the connecting rod's on the outside, and then it's spaced out here to match. Blind driving wheels were more common on locomotives with 3 or more driver axles, such as this 260 Mogul. This is the J.C. Davis, built 1875. Flanged driver on the rear, flanged driver on the front, center driver blind, not flanged, but you'll notice it's considerably wider. There's like a good couple of inches that aren't there on the front and rear drivers. You need that because there's so much space in between them. Another example of blind drivers is this 080. Memnon was built in 1853 and served in the Civil War alongside the William Mason. The two middle sets of drivers are blind, leaving the front flanged pair of drivers to guide the engine around curves. Note how the cylinders are raised up and steeply angled to make room for the front pair of drivers. This was common on locomotives built in the 1850s and earlier. Later, the angled cylinder setup gave way to the more traditional design of horizontal cylinders mounted further forward. A good example of this is the A.J. Cromwell, a 280 built in 1888. By this point, the overall configuration of steam locomotives had been pretty much figured out, and instead of radically new designs, attention was focused on improving the basic formula. You'll note that this one does not have blind center drivers. Another thing that's notable about this engine is that this one is equipped with air brakes. The air compressor, driven by steam from the boiler, pumps compressed air into this tank. From there, it can be sent to the brake cylinder, which applies pressure to the brake shoes and slows down the train. This also allows the brakes on the entire train to be controlled from the locomotive. This is a Winans Camel, built in 1869, an early version of what would come to be known as a camelback locomotive. Instead of the cab being at the rear of the engine as usual, it was placed on top of the boiler to make room for a larger firebox. This design was abandoned after only a few years, but would be revisited decades later with the better-known camelback type. This one was built in 1901. These were specifically intended to burn anthracite coal, which requires a very wide firebox, so the cab was moved forward to accommodate it. Although they had some improvements over the old version, this was still a fundamentally flawed design. The fireman was still exposed to the weather and unable to communicate with the engineer, and the cab still got dangerously hot inside. Some engineers got around this problem by sitting on the window ledge, and at least one fell out of the window while doing this. Because of the high rates of deaths and injuries on these engines, building new ones was outlawed in 1918, although some remained in service until the 1930s. This particular one is a 442 Atlantic type with Walschaerts external valve gear as opposed to the Stephenson internal valve gear of the older engines. Oh, and look at the little Pioneer. 25,000 pounds. It's just baby. Look at the steam dome. It's like it's hovering. Oh, this thing's so adorable. Now we come to my favorite part of the whole museum. Clinchfield Railroad No. 1 is a fairly typical 460 built in 1882, but what's special about it is that the museum guests can actually go inside the cab. I'm a pretty big train nerd, and even I only know what about half of this stuff does, but it's such a cool experience to be able to sit in the engineer's seat, pull back on the throttle, and travel back in time. It's stuff like this that reminds me why I love museums. When the reverse is in the center position, the throttle hits it. Little quirks like that you just don't get with the models. This is as close as I've ever gotten to my dream of operating a real steam locomotive, and even if I'm technically just sitting on a box listening to chugging sound through speakers, it's still pretty dang cool. There's also more to see in the roundhouse than just locomotives, like this adorable four-wheeled bobber caboose. These were a staple of 19th century freight railroading and Christmas toy train sets, but were phased out around the turn of the century because their wooden frames and rudimentary suspension made them relatively dangerous and rough riding. The limitations of wooden frames are also visible on this 1868 passenger coach. Although the design is absolutely beautiful, the Achilles heel of these wooden coaches is apparent when you sight down the length of it and see how much it sags. These coaches had metal truss rods underneath to help reinforce the frame, but there was only so much those could do. Many were later rebuilt with steel frames, but around the turn of the century the shift was made to all steel construction for passenger cars, which was much sturdier and safer. Now this stuff is all fascinating to me, but if I covered everything in the museum, this video would go on for hours. So let's move on from the real trains to some more models. There's another HO scale layout inside an old steel passenger car. This one is even more visually spectacular and has a wider variety of trains as well. I even spotted a familiar face hiding in the back on a yard track. There are a couple of diesel switchers on auto-reversing tracks to make it look like they're switching cars at the various industries, which is a nice touch. The scenery is absolutely gorgeous on this layout, and there's a very detailed city scene with some impressive buildings as well. Heading outside, there's a G-scale garden railway. It's a bit sun-faded, as you'd expect, but still pretty cool to see. There are two separate loops with buttons that visitors can push to make the trains run. This layout is located near one of the station platforms, where the museum sometimes runs full-size trains, but nothing was running today because of an upcoming Polar Express event. For the same reason, the car shop was closed, so I'll have to come back another time to see all the awesome locomotives and cars that are in there. You will note, you have a platform at the front, with no way to get to it from the cab. Yeah, you can get to it from the outside, and you can get into the cab from the outside, but you have to get off the engine and back on to get onto that platform. In addition to the running models, the museum also has a room of super detailed custom-built static models illustrating the evolution of locomotives and cars over time. Seeing them all in order, you can really appreciate how much the designs have changed over time, from the dainty little experimental engines of the early 1800s to the massive beasts of the late steam era. This exhibit covers the transition to diesel locomotives as well, and has a huge cutaway model of an E-unit showing how it all works inside. I could make a whole video just on this room, not to mention the exhibits on clocks, the postal service, the dynamometer car, and all the rest of the amazing stuff this museum has. But in the interest of getting this video finished in time for Christmas, I think it's time to wrap it up. However, this wasn't the only museum we went to on this trip. We also took a train down to Washington, D.C. and stopped by the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, which really should have been a video in itself, but for now I'll just show you a few of my favorite things. This place has the real original Wright Flyer, the first powered airplane to ever fly. It also has the real spacesuit that Neil Armstrong wore when he first walked on the moon. Something I wasn't expecting to find was Casey Jones's original wooden grave marker, which was replaced with a stone one. Another thing I didn't expect to see here was racing legend Richard Petty's number 43 Pontiac, which he drove to his 200th and final NASCAR victory in the 1984 Firecracker 400. This museum was just as amazing as the B&O, even though half of it was closed for renovation, but probably my favorite thing there was the filming model of the Starship Enterprise from the original Star Trek. As a lifelong Trekkie, it was truly something special to stand in the presence of the real Enterprise, lovingly restored and looking absolutely gorgeous. Something interesting about this model is that it was only ever finished on one side. The other side has all the wires and stuff for the lights. In the show, it was almost always shown from the right side, and for the few times when they had to show the other side of the model, such as when it was used for the evil alternate timeline Enterprise in the Mirror Universe episode, they re-lettered it with mirrored decals and flipped the image left to right. Anyway folks, that's all for now. We had very limited time on this trip, so I didn't get to film as much as I'd like, but eventually maybe I'll go back and make more in-depth videos on both museums. For now, I have lots of model train videos in the works, so stay tuned. Have a great holiday, and I'll see you next year.